Information on the history of basketball. There is evidence, or there has been evidence of a game that is somewhat similar to basketball that was played in Native American communities, mostly in southern Mexico. The Aztecs were known to play a game. You can see the picture here where you have the little ring inside the, whatever this might be, an arena or something, with a rubber ball. In actuality, that was not true. There was a ring, but it was played with the skulls of sacrificed or prisoners of war, which is kind of a weird way of doing it, but it has the replication of what basketball might be doing. This dude right here looked like he's getting dunked on. So people got dunked on back then. More historically accurate probably would be the way the game was developed. And probably not a good word to use, develop, because it actually was invented. But once it was invented, it then developed, right? So as football kind of made its transition from soccer to rugby, from rugby to a combination of rugby, soccer, to eventually what becomes football, and baseball went through some of the same stuff. Being kind of developed from cricket into some segments of what was called hook ball in Europe, and then eventually it forms into obviously the game that we see today. Basketball was a little bit different. It was invented by Dr. James Naismith, who was a teacher, physical education teacher, and he was given the task of trying to find something to occupy boys during the winter months in the Northeast primarily. And so you couldn't go outside. You had a bunch of kids in there. Obviously, you can imagine, high school or middle school age kids, boys with nothing to do all winter. They're getting cabin fever. They're getting unruly. They're getting mischievous, whatever boys do. And so Dr. Naismith was given the task of organizing some sort of game. And he came up with this idea. He kind of used origins of different games. Like he kind of used hockey in a little bit. He used a soccer ball as the original basketball. And so, it's kind of a unique situation for the way that the game was developed. There was no baskets or backboard at that point. They just simply took a peach basket and they nailed it on top of in these YMCAs, nailed on top of, kind of the wooden braces or whatever, and developed the game from there. As a matter of fact, they didn't even cut out the bottom of the peach basket. They actually had a ladder that they would climb up and get the ball out of the basket each time it was scored, which wasn't very often initially. And then a little bit later on, they would drill a small little hole in the bottom of the basket, and they would use a broomstick and pop the ball out. It wasn't until actually a couple years into the process that they actually thought about, hey, let's just cut the bottom out of the basket and make it a lot easier for people, right? Anyways, so of the original 13 rules that Dr. Naismith had drawn up, 9 have been actually still are incorporated in the game. Obviously, they've been modified, but some things that are part of the game today, like the throw-in, the jump ball, beginning of the game, anyways, things of that sort are now still part of the game, but they were drawn up a part of those original rules. As I mentioned, the motivation for the game being invented and then continually developed is during that muscular Christianity movement we talked about a little bit in boxing, where there was a huge movement towards getting kids involved in physical education, the physical strength and sportsmanship and things of that sort, because a lot of these kids were moved into the cities during the latter part of the 1800s, early 1900s, that were at one time working on farms. And so, when you're working on a farm, you're physically active, like you're working the fields, you're doing the plowing, you're, baling hay or whatever. But as society changes and more people are moving into the cities, obviously there wasn't that avenue for physical activity. So YMCAs were created as a result of that. And basketball happened to be part of that, along with other sports. We talked about boxing and so forth. The first game that was recorded was played in December of 1891. It's played in Springfield, Massachusetts, which by no ironic twist, it is now the location of the Basketball Hall of Fame. And again, it was kind of a different game. Obviously, the score was 1-0, but the score was scored differently then, obviously, than it is now. The game back then was like volleyball is today, like it was played in matches. And if you won the match, that would be the game type of thing. So if you won 2 out of 3 matches, then you got 1 win as a game. Kind of a different way of scoring, but that's how it was done originally. And the game was played with 9 players on each side, as opposed to 5 players today. Now, there's a couple of different rumors as to how it developed that way. I've read some information where Dr. Naismith was using baseballs, 9 players, as a kind of a way to, translate that into basketball. But I've also read information where Dr. Naismith's class that he was given had 18 people or 18 boys. And so it was easier just to divide them up into 2 groups of 9. Either or, 9 players are on the team at the time. And the gyms were incredibly small. 50 feet by 35 feet would be a normal size, and that's not very big, obviously. So it's kind of crazy how you put 9 people on a relatively small gymnasium floor. Today the game is played on most larger high schools like Kentwood, Rockford, Caledonia, and things. They play on a 94-foot by 53-foot floor. Lot, obviously bigger area. There's one of the pictures of the earliest gyms that were used in some of the YMCA's. You can see a balcony above that. And you can see that, these are the type of things where the rims would be nailed on, no backboard. And so kind of a, real primitive approach to, the game that we know today. Early rule changes, obviously, they had to adapt as they went. Right. Naismith's original set of 13 rules established many things, including the concept of traveling, like you couldn't grab the ball and run with it. Goaltending, you couldn't knock the ball off the rim. Fouls, even the inbound 5-second rule was part of the original rules. Obviously, since then, a lot of those rules have been established. One of the kind of the funny things is that one of the most used skills today in the game is dribbling, and that was not part of the original rules. As a matter of fact, it was illegal. I shouldn't say illegal. It wasn't even a thing. Like they were told to pass the ball or to like bump it like a volleyball underhand serve type of way of advancing the ball from one person to the next. And it was by happenstance that dribbling became a thing where, the story goes, again, these are kind of legends and urban legends and whatever you want to call them, but some of the players in the class started just dribbling, like bouncing the ball instead of passing it. And it just kind of organically developed as a skill, and dribbling became a thing. And then they developed, then they said, well, you can't double dribble. In other words, you can't dribble it with 2 hands and catch it. You have to keep one hand on it. And, obviously dribbling became a thing. The number of players by 1900 was obviously dwindled down to 5 per team on the floor together, which is obviously how the game is played today. Which obviously is a lot easier to play when this court isn't as compacted and populated as if there was 9 players. And if you're a basketball person, you might know the term spacing. A lot of coaches will talk about spacing, like the amount of area between players. Well, it's very difficult to have spacing on a relatively small court with 9 guys on your team. You require jump ball, which is kind of one of the most weirdest rules that took the long time for people to figure out how that it should be changed. Up until the late 1930s, whenever someone scored a basket in the game, there would be a jump ball at midcourt. There was not continuous play like you see today. So as a result, the game was very low scoring and slow and methodical, not very entertaining to watch. It wasn't, I guess, as I said, it wasn't until 1938 that people started, to come up with the idea was, hey, that's just when someone scores, let's just take it out of bounds and go. Why do we have to wait for a jump ball? The collegiate game developed, you see collegiate is spelled wrong in my little title there, but collegiate game was developed obviously faster than the college game, or I'm sorry, the pro game, much like football during that time period, which is different. Baseball is a game that professionally started right away. It was a professional game from day one. Basketball and football really developed more along the lines of collegiate things. It's a little comparison. So the first known college big game that was played, and there's contrasting stories about who actually was involved in the first game, so to speak. But according to legend, 1893, the first college game was played where Vanderbilt University played against a YMCA team from Nashville. And if you don't know anything about Vanderbilt University, they are centered in Nashville. So it really wasn't a college playing a college, but it was the first time a college team played the game of basketball. As a matter of fact, when you go to Vanderbilt, there is a plaque, I think, outside their arena that says, this is the site of the first ever college basketball game. Now, it's a little misleading because they didn't play another college. About a year later, the University of Iowa played the University of Chicago in the first game that was intercollegiate. In other words, two college teams playing against each other, also using a 5-man lineup. That was relatively new. Again, this is 1893, this is 1894. So it's around that latter part of the 1890s, right around the turn of the century, where the game was, the teams were limited to 5 players on the floor at a time. One of the most innovative individuals in the game was a man by the name of Hank Lucetti, who played at Stanford University. And if you ever watch old videos of basketball being played, sometimes you mock kids or mock your I shouldn't say kids, you mock your old man or your grandpa about how they shoot, two-handed set shot. In actuality, that's how the shot was taken for most of the early part of the game, around 1920s, early 1930s. And actually the set shot was shot differently. Is actually the hand placement was on the sides of the ball. And they didn't put the hand under the ball yet. They put them on the sides of the ball, and they just kind of launched it towards the basket. Hank Lucetti was one of the first. I'm not sure if he was the first one to do it, but it's the first one at the collegiate level who came up with the idea of the one hand under the basketball. So again, if you're a basketball person, you went to a camp when you were in 4th or 5th grade or played AAU at that level, your coaches taught you the old elbow under the ball. They used to use the term beef, balance, eyes, elbow and follow through. That was his, like Hank Lucetti was the person who kind of came up with that idea. And also to jump when you shot instead of just standing on the floor. So you could elevate over someone, get your shot off quicker type of thing. So Hank Lucetti was the first collegiate player to use that type of technique in shooting. It innovated the game, although coaches were not real receptive originally of that type of different way of shooting. Coaches tend to be a little bit controlling, some of you might know. And when people came up with a better idea, they didn't really welcome it yet. But when, you see Lucetti scoring 50 points a game, where it might take teams 2 games to score 50 points. Prior to that, a lot of people started to say this is probably a better way to shoot. So for a period of time, when Lucetti was a thing at Stanford University, he averaged double figures in scoring. Stanford was extremely successful as a team during that time period, and so that innovation in the shot became a thing throughout college basketball. The first actual tournament, we're in tournament season, of course, is kind of a perfect time to study this course, or this part of the course anyways, was not the NCAA tournament like you see today with 64 teams or 68 teams, technically, whatever. The first original tournament that the NCAA sponsored was the National Invitation Tournament, the NIT, still going on today. Matter of fact, there was NIT opening games on last night. And this was the main tournament. Like, if you were in college in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, you wanted to play in the NIT. The NCAA tournament that we know today wasn't even a thing until a little bit later on. It's the oldest tournament, as I mentioned. The first tournament started in 1938 as a postseason tournament, and it was played throughout the country as normal. Basketball was really centered a lot like football was in the Northeast, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in New York. Those were big basketball towns in the early part of the 1900s, just like they were early basketball towns and early football towns. I mean, population-wise, the majority of the United States population was centered in that area anyways. And most of the big-time colleges were in that area. And so it was just a natural thing, for those sports to kind of take hold in that area. The NCAA tournament, as we know it today, not nearly as popular as it is, happened the year following. So the National Invitation Tournament is not a sponsored NCAA tournament. It's a separate tournament. And the NCAA is obviously sponsored by the NCAA. March Madness, obviously a huge thing, in our society. It's probably right up there with the Super Bowl and the World Cup in terms of number of people watching. The term March Madness was actually coined by a person of the press. He came up with that moniker, if you want to call it that. But in the first NCAA tournament played in 1939, University of Oregon defeated Ohio State.
Mr. Hart, please see Mr. Beck. Nick Hardman to back.
Sorry about that. But anyways, the tournament was played in 1939, and the University of Oregon was the first national champion in the NCAA tournament. Kind of a little trivia question you might not know. It only had 8 teams. 8 teams. If you know anything about bracket play, if you play AAU or might play club volleyball or travel soccer, those brackets that are all over the place, right? They usually have to be in groups of multiples of 4 so that you can have a nice, easy tournament. Now you have some playing games, you got some buys, things of that sort. But that's why when you look at the history of the NCAA tournament, it's always in groups of multiples of 4. Originally started at 8, then it went to 16, it went to 32, then it went to 64. Makes it for a nice, easy, clean tournament. You don't have to worry about seedings or buys or who plays who type of thing. As I mentioned, during the 1950s, the number of teams grew to 16, and then eventually you see today it's 64, but technically it's 68 because you have those play-in games, right, that are happening, I think, tonight on television. Anyways, the 68 team was ultimately developed in 2011, and that's the way it goes today. But the play-in games eliminate 4 teams, and so it goes from 68 down to 64, and then then the tournament coincides there. The most successful NCAA men's tournament teams are UCLA. They've won 11 championships. Kentucky has won 7. Indiana has won 5. Now those numbers might be a little off because this was from last year, but I still believe that UCLA is still way out in front. They won several championships in the 1960s. I think they won 6 or 7 in a row. When they had Bill Walton and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and those are names of the past. But anyways, another historic thing in basketball was Olympic basketball, Team USA, so to speak. So basketball made its first appearance as a demonstration sport in 1904. So really early on. And what a demonstration sport is, it's a sport that's played in the Olympics, but not for medals. It's just for demonstration. 1936 in Berlin was the first time that basketball was played as a medal sport. And the United States won the gold medal that year, and they won the gold medal every year in men's basketball until 1972. And we kind of covered that a little bit. And when we talked about the Olympics, all the crazy ending to the Russian game in 1972 played in Munich. Women's basketball debuted as an Olympic sport in 1976, played in Montreal. US teams, as I said, had won every gold medal in US in the Olympic gold medal round, except for the 72 game, what we talked about, the 70 with the Soviet Union. Also the 1980 game in Yugoslavia, only because the United States was not there. They boycotted. Yugoslavia won the gold medal that year. Those games were played in Moscow, which was in the Soviet Union. The United States had boycotted. 1988 was probably the most famous. That brings on the famous Dream Team. The United States had lost in the medal round. They didn't even take the silver that year. They ended up taking the bronze, and that put shockwaves through the United States about basketball. And Europeans are getting better, and Soviet Union won the Olympic and won the gold medal, and we can't let this happen. The Soviet Union are using pros; they're getting paid. Why aren't we using our pros? That brings on the 2004 Olympics, where there's more, craziness going on. Argentina wins the gold medal. Again, the United States loses. And that brings on, going back here, I'm getting ahead of myself. The 92 games, Olympics was when the Dream Team played with, Magic and Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, and that group. And then again, in 2004, we lose, even though there was a Dream Team, quote unquote, that played, they lost, and it was not a very good situation. Bad team, bad players, bad coaching. They kind of got lazy with the process. And then in 2008, we had what was called the Redeem Team. That was the LeBron James, the Kobe, that whole group. And we'll watch a Netflix video on that. It's really pretty good. Netflix show on the Redeem Team. It's pretty interesting. So getting back to the Dream Team, you can see that's the original Dream Team. The players that are on there, you can see Patrick Ewing here, played for the Knicks, Magic, obviously for the Lakers. David Robinson played for the Spurs. Karl Malone played originally for the Jazz, later on played for the Lakers. Charles Barkley played for Philadelphia, and later on ended his career in Phoenix. Chris Mullin, who played for the Clippers, or not the Clippers, the Warriors. There's Michael Jordan, obviously the Bulls, ended his career as a Wizard. Larry Bird with the Celtics. Scottie Pippen played obviously with the Chicago Bulls and ended his career in Houston. John Stockton, who also played for the Jazz, and Clyde Drexler, who played for the Trailblazers. The only collegiate player they had was Christian Laettner from Duke. And there's a very controversial story about this team involving Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, and Isaiah Thomas from the Pistons, who should have been on that team. And story goes, the rivalry between Jordan and Isaiah, between the Pistons and the Bulls, kept Isaiah off that team. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. As I mentioned, they blew past, I think they won every game by like 30. Wasn't even it was more of a spectacle than anything else. As a matter of fact, most of the teams that they were playing, the players wanted the autographs more than they wanted to play the game. They wanted to make sure that they get their pictures taken, and it was crazy. Little side note again, Chuck Daly, who was the coach of the Dream Team, was the Pistons coach and was Isaiah Thomas's coach with the Pistons. And Isaiah still was not selected as part of that Dream Team. So anyways, that just kind of really quickly goes over the intro to basketball, going from the origins to the collegiate game to the Olympic game. We'll study basketball on the NBA level or the professional level like we did in football in a different part of the unit. So